Hello class. We are going to do another lecture in regard to the material in Political Science 105. First of all, I just want to acknowledge some of the things that are going on out there. The President had a press conference the other day, and during that press conference, his new perspective is that this is a lot worse than we thought, which many of us had said 2 months ago. As a matter of fact, if you remember 2 months ago, at that time we had 15 detected cases of coronavirus, and he said that it would be down to 0 but in a week. The other night, the President tells us that it is very possible we will have over 100,000 deaths. And that if we do have 100,000 deaths, he's done a good job. It's hard for me to understand how 100,000 deaths are acceptable, especially when we as a government could have done more to avoid this, like many other governments throughout the world did do in terms of early testing and detection. That's why you do early testing and detection, so you can see where it's originating, how it's spreading, and then you can isolate those areas before it spreads anymore. Well, it's too late now, guys. According to all the statistics, the coronavirus is now in every state in the United States. People have died in every state of the United States. People of all ages, so it's not just seniors. Yes, seniors are more susceptible, but young people are dying. A 16-year-old died the other day. 34-year-old, hospital workers. So this is a real problem. And then along with it, obviously, the economy is experiencing its worst unemployment numbers in the last 40 years. And some economists think we'll be in a recession within the next month or two. I do not blame that part directly on our government because clearly a pandemic is not something that anybody plans for in terms of economics. But I do blame it on our government to the extent that we could have done more to avoid this. And to the extent that we didn't do that, the health implications for our society are that much worse, which leads to the recession. So there's a lot of stuff going on out there. Please stay aware. I'm no longer requiring you to do presentations for current events, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be reading about these things. You shouldn't be reading the Wall Street Journal. You shouldn't be reading the New York Times. You shouldn't be reading the Washington Post. For democracy to work, as you know, and as I've preached to you guys before, we need an informed citizenship. That's critical. And I don't care, again, what your values are, what you want to advocate for, as long as it's informed. If you are just going to advocate without knowledge, that is destructive to democracy. So please stay informed, know what's going on. All right. Just to kind of make sure everybody knows where we are in regard to this class, today I'm going to talk about interest groups, which is JANDA Chapter 10. And then the end of next week we will talk about the organization of the courts and our legal system. So that'll be our introduction to law. And that will be Chapter 14. So please read Chapter 14 for the end of this week. And once we complete that, just so you know, we will be talking about civil rights, which is Chapter 16, which is a specific application of this whole idea of the legal system and constitutional law. So that's where we are in regard to this class. All right, so today, as I said, what we want to do is we want to talk about interest groups. And we have another outline for you in regard to interest groups. So first we want to ask, what is an interest group? What are its primary functions? What are the benefits and detriments of interest group behavior? what types of interest group lobbying is there, and we'll talk about direct versus grassroots, and what are current campaign finance laws, and how do they influence the activities of interest groups. So we'll talk about the Federal Election Campaign Act, referred to in shorthand as FECA, and a very important historical case in regard to the Federal Election Campaign Act, Buckley versus Vallejo. So let's start with this question of what is an interest group? And your book talks about this. Matter of fact, it talks about it on page 262, excuse me. And it says that an interest group is an organized body of individuals who share some political goals and try to influence public policy decisions of our government. So they're groups that get together and try and influence what our government does or doesn't do. So when we talk about what are the primary functions of an interest group, if you remember back to our systems model, interest groups are a linkage mechanism. So they can link the public and public opinions, their demands, their needs, and their supports to the operation of our political institutions. All of us have interests that we want to have heard by government and things that we care about. And through the activities of interest groups, we can have our views communicated to government officials. And interest groups are different than some other forms of linkage mechanism. For example, elections. So, we had an election, obviously, for president 3.5 years ago. And we had Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, through the Electoral College, won election as President of the United States. So the question is, what did that election mean? Did that mean we as the public supported everything he said, everything he wanted to do in regard to the environment, in regard to energy production, in regard to free trade? What did it mean? Or did it just mean we thought Hillary was terrible, lock her up? She was terrible, and therefore we were just voting for Trump as protest against Hillary Clinton. Well, the point is that it's often very hard to interpret the mandate of an election because a candidate may talk about 20 different issues during a presidential campaign. But we don't necessarily agree with the candidate on all of them. Even the candidates we vote for, maybe there's 5 or 6 things that we don't like that they say. So the idea is interest group activity gives us as citizens of the United States the opportunity to articulate our perspective in regard to every specific issue and give government more direction. So it's within that context that we talk about the benefits and detriments of interest group activity. So what are the benefits? The benefits are kind of what I'm saying. First, and the book again talks about this on page 264, enhanced representation. Interest group activity gives its members the ability to articulate their concerns in a more specific manner, to go to government and say, hey, here's how we feel about environmental issues or gun issues or abortion issues or whatever is of interest to that particular group. And as we said, elections have shortcomings, which interest groups in their ideal form can help alleviate. They can provide more specific issue direction. So that's the first thing it does, enhance representation. Secondly, it provides enhanced participation. You can get more people directly involved in the political process. So if in the United States you have the opportunity to go to Congress, to write letters to the president, This gives you an opportunity to directly participate in American democracy, to have more involvement. Third thing that we find as a benefit of interest groups is they serve an educational function. So what an interest group tries to do is, first of all, educate their members to the issue. Here's why this is an important issue. Here's why we take the stand that we do. And then use that information, use facts that you can accumulate, evidence, gee, and even science sometimes, that would be nice. And then go to government officials and try and educate them to that group's perspective on these issues and why it's important and why they should be doing what they should be doing. As part of that, the other thing that interest group behavior does is agenda building. So it gives us, as citizens in our country, an opportunity to bring new issues to the forefront of the American political system. To tell our elected officials, look, you should be working on this. This is something you should care about. This is something we care about. Please do something in this regard. And lastly, it serves the function of program monitoring. So as government is doing things, it gives us an opportunity to say, we don't like what you're doing, please stop it. Or, we like what you're doing, please do more of it. So those are the potential benefits of interest group activity. The question is, what are the detriments? What are the detriments? And there have been a lot of books written by political scientists about interest group activity. And probably one of the first and most famous people to write about interest groups, and you don't have to know his name, but I'll tell you anyway, is by a political scientist known as E.E. Schatzsnyder. And he studied interest group activity for many, many years. And he says, the detriment of interest group activity is that very often interest groups do not represent the general public, and to a major degree simply ignore the beliefs and concerns of the sovereign majority. And this can lead to a short-circuiting of majority attitudes and concerns. He said, in other words, a political system which provides access for all the active and legitimate groups in our society actually ends up in a biased system. A system of bias and policy towards the best organized and financed and resourced groups. He said, why? He says, well, active and an active group implies a lot of things. Organization, structure, leadership, and resources. And according to Schatzsnyder, not everyone in society who's experiencing problems or has concerns about what our government does or doesn't do has these advantages. Not everybody has a lot of resources at their disposal. Not everyone has an organizational structure that they can rely on. In fact, Schatzsnyder concludes that an empirical analysis of government in the United States demonstrates that the American system is biased to well-financed groups. So in regard to the detriment, he calls it the mobilization of bias. The mobilization bias. That it's these small, well-financed business groups that tend to have a disproportionate impact on our government and what government does or doesn't do. Well, the question then is, why is the American system biased towards these affluent small business groups? And when we say small business groups, I don't mean in money, and I don't mean in influence. So the oil companies, we would call a small group, not because it's not a multi-billion-dollar industry, but because as a percentage of the population, it's a very small cross-section of American society. Out of the over 300 million people we have, very few as a percentage are affiliated with the oil industry. Yet what we find is they tend to have a disproportionate impact on the policies of our country. And I'll give an example of that in a little bit. So, why is the American political system biased toward these small, affluent business groups versus the general public? The first explanation that Chad Snyder gives, why interest groups, is what he refers to as the belief in Olson's law of large groups. What the heck does that mean? Olson's law of large groups. And why does this explain this disproportionate influence? Well, Olson's law of large groups was written by a man named Manker Olson, who was a political scientist at Yale. And after analyzing interest groups, he concluded, as did Chad Snyder, that interest group behavior in the United States is incredibly biased towards well-financed groups. And he explains why well-financed business groups are more active and influential than large public groups or the general public. He says, think about it. Every interest group is motivated by the goal of making its members receive some kind of benefit. That's why you're doing this. You want a benefit. And he calls it a collective benefit for all those members. Collective benefit. So, interest groups are trying to provide their members with something that they want. Now, collective benefit, or good, whatever you want to call it, is anything of value, something that you value. So it can be money or profit. That's an obvious one. I want more money, I want more profit, so please pass this law, it'll make my business more profitable. But it can be things like clean air, safer cities, more access to health care. But the thing about a collective benefit is a collective benefit cannot be withheld from anyone who is a member of that group. So if the group is successful in getting it, everybody benefits from it, whether they were active or not. So according to Olson, small, well-financed business groups have an organizational advantage over the general public. And they have this advantage in that they will work more actively and work harder to secure their share of the collective good than the general public will. Why? Well, according to Olson, it's because their share of the collective good is large enough to be of great benefit to them, which provides them more determination, more motivation. And to explain this, Olson comes up with the term free rider problem. The free rider problem. And the free rider problem is discussed in your book on page 268. And the free rider problem is a situation in which people can benefit from the activities of an organization without contributing to their activities. I mean, so that's kind of like the best of all worlds. I can get what I want without doing anything. But the problem is that mentality has a major impact on general public groups that represent the American citizen. And Olson refers to this as the let George do it problem. Okay, yeah, we're all concerned about clean air, but are you, as a person who's concerned with clean air, are you going to write letters to your members of Congress? Are you going to organize and go down to Washington, D.C. and make demands or march? Are you going to contribute money to organizations which care about clean air? So ask yourself as students, how many of you really become active in saying to government, here's what I believe in. Here's what I want you to do. And what we find when we ask students these questions is that very few students ever get involved. Now, if students or the general public got involved, it would be very hard for government to ignore their demands. You're not going to turn your back on the general public. But what we find is the general public tends to be apathetic and ill-informed. And to the extent that the general public is apathetic and or ill-informed, it allows these smaller vested interest groups to get their perspectives passed by our government. So let me give you an example, and I think that's the best way to really illustrate this whole idea of the free rider problem. And let's talk about when it just happened the other day. So there's been this debate between President Trump and Congress over air pollution standards. So you might ask yourself, how do I feel about air pollution standards? And in asking that question, what we mean by that is, should we have and support current air pollution standards, which have led to significant reductions in pollutants in our water and air, and supposedly are helping us with this whole global warming issue, whether you believe in that or not? The question is, what do you think government should do? Should government eliminate air pollution standards or make them more lax so that more pollutants can be emitted into the environment? And public health groups are saying if we relax these standards, it's going to have significant long-term implications for the health, the welfare of our country. Long-term, more lung disease, more cancers, more global warming, which then has an impact on weather, which then can have a major impact on our agricultural crops and many of our industries. So the reason I bring this up is because President Trump has been debating this issue with the United States Congress. And Congress, and especially the House of Representatives, has said, we do not want to weaken air pollution standards that could be a disaster. That as people who care about our environment, who care about our future, who believe that the scientists are right when they're saying we have an issue with global warming, and that over 100 other countries endorse the idea that we have to reduce carbon emissions to make our environment safe, and that we only have about another 10 or 15 years to do this, or it's going to be too late. There'll be no way to reverse it. So that's the perspective of Congress, and particularly the House of Representatives, which is controlled by the Democratic Party. Now the Senate's more divided because it's President Trump's party, and a lot of people do not want to contradict President Trump. But President Trump's perspective is, I want to loosen environmental standards because it'll help the economy grow. Well, how does this relate to the free rider problem? Well, the point is, this is a very important public issue. And the question is, how are interest groups going to intervene here? Well, there's an economic study that was done that showed that the 9 major oil companies will, if this new regulation is enacted by President Trump, will net over $900 million more in profits. Okay? So, think about that. Say you're the president of Mobil Oil or Shell Oil, and they tell you, if we can lessen air pollution standards, you're going to get, on average, another $100 million in profits. How much money would you be willing to spend to get that legislation passed? Are you going to hire interest group lobbyists to go down to D.C. and tell members of Congress, tell the president, yes, we need this? Will the specter of a $100 million profit motivate you to act as the president of oil company? And what Olson is saying is yes, that these small vested interests will mobilize, but the general public won't. Olson's law of large groups. That we as citizens and public groups will say, well, George will do something about it. There's got to be other people who know more about it. And for the most part, we as the public remain unmoved and uninvolved. And for the most part, unaware. Are oil companies aware of the impact of different regulations passed by government on their industry? You bet. That's a full-time job for them. So that's just one example. And we see the same kinds of things with numerous kind of issues. Tobacco subsidies, healthcare issues, energy issues, car manufacturing issues, lemon laws. In each case, the lobbyists for those industries were very active, while the general public was not. So this whole idea of Olson's law of large groups and the free rider problem is one explanation for why these small vested business groups are much more influential in deciding what the policies and laws of our country are. The second major issue of why, so if this is the first free rider problem, the second issue is money. Money. So theoretically, as Schatzsnyder acknowledged, anybody can become an interest group. So, we can form an interest group called the Desario Political Science 105 Interest Group. And we can try and then inform ourselves about the most important issues that we care about in our society. And then we can organize and we can go to Washington, D.C. and make demands on members of Congress and the President of the United States. But will we? Will we? Well, first of all, that takes a lot of money. We got to fly down to Washington, D.C. and do this. We've got to spend time and energy collecting research, contacting experts. That takes time and money. So if I pass a hat around the classroom and I say, please contribute to this, isn't it important that we have an impact on our society? Maybe I'll get a couple of dollars. And that's not going to be enough to organize us and to mobilize us. So when we talk about money, what we're saying is money can be utilized in many ways to influence the laws that our government passes or does not pass. And these big groups like oil companies have hundreds of millions of dollars at their disposal. And lobbyists can make campaign contributions, can use the money for public information, can have television commercials, can produce magazines and newsletters and web advertising to influence public opinion. So, one group of oil companies put together a PAC, which is an interest group, and they called it the PAC for Responsible Citizens. So it sounds like a public citizen group, but it's not. And they spend millions trying to influence the actions of members of Congress. All right, well, how can you use this money? Well, this relates to the idea of the types of interest group lobbying: direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. And again, this is also in your book. So direct lobbying is on page 274. And we'll talk about that first. Direct